Hello and welcome to Code Harvest. This is part 7 of our eLife web series where we show you how to create a slider or a slideshow, allowing users to view multiple products in a row with a smooth transition. If you're new here, this is part of our step-by-step tutorial video on how to create a product page for an e-commerce website using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, where we also include UI designs such as sliders, animations, and so on. This e-commerce specifically sells electronics, and the company name we created is eLife. Now, due to how long the full tutorial is, we have separated it into different videos and parts. So this is part 7 once again of the product page tutorial. So check out the full playlist in the description and the top comments down below. Now, we also created a tutorial for the home page of the website. So link to that video is in the description down below as well. So please subscribe to Code Harvest, and now let's get started. Alright, so now let's scroll down, and here we'll just create a new line and we'll create a new section. And we're going to call this slideshow with a comment. So now we're going to be creating the slideshow of our product page. So that's basically all of this. So when we click on the next button, we should see another product card appear here. If we go previous, we should see another product card appear here. So we should go back, or next, we should go to the next product. And same for all the other sections. And because we're going to do this for multiple sections, for multiple different sections, it's going to be a little long. I mean, the JavaScript code will be a little long, but that's fine. It will also be really simple and really easy. Alright, so first we need to select all of these slideshow buttons. So when we scroll down and when we check our HTML page, we can see that we named our slideshow button something specific. So when you see in our slideshow buttons container, both the previous button and the next one have a class that they both have, which is called slideshow button. And now what we want to do right now is we want to select all of the buttons, whether it be previous or next. We just want to select all of the buttons and then we'll process them in JavaScript. So they're both in a class called slideshow-button. So we will create a new variable. So first we're going to declare it, and we're going to name this variable slideshow buttons. So now what we want to do is we want to select all of the buttons that have the class slideshow button, whether it be previous or next. So we're going to use query selector all, so it will return a list or an array. And since it's a class, we have to select it with a dot and then add in the name of the class. And now we'll end that line with a semicolon. Alright, so now we're going to go straight to processing all of these buttons, and we're going to process them through a for each loop method. So what we want to do is, call out the slideshow buttons array, and then we're going to use for each rather than the for loop, and we're going to, in our parameter, which is basically going to be, the element that is currently, or the button that is currently being processed in the loop, we're going to call it simply button. So now we're going to create an arrow function, and we're going to create curly brackets. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to add an event listener for each of the buttons. So for all buttons, we need to add an event listener, so we want to listen to any click. So we're going to use the add event listener method. So simply button, then add event listener, and we want to specifically listen for any click event. So anything that the user clicks, but specifically a button in the array. So now we're going to create an arrow function. And now inside, we want to first create a variable, and we're going to call it slideshow section. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to select, and we want to know from which section the button has been clicked, because we have 6 different sections here, and we do not know which button was clicked, which section in which the button was clicked from. So we need to know which section it came from. And in order to do that, when we scroll down and when we check our HTML code, here you can see that each slideshow button has a parent element, and the parent element has a class called slideshow buttons container, but that's not important. But it also has a data set, and this data set is called slideshow. So we named this data set slideshow earlier. It could be any name that we wanted to choose. So we chose the name slideshow, and the value we set it to. So this one is called all. And then when we scroll down, we can see that in another section, so for example the headphones section, we can see that this one has the same data set, but the value has been set to headphones. And likewise for all the other sections. This one is the smartwatch section, so we use the same data set, but the value is different, and we called it smartwatch. So from that, we'll be able to select the buttons section. So first of all, we're going to call out the parent element. since the dataset is in the parent element of the slideshow buttons. And then we will call out the dataset, and the dataset name is called slideshow simply, which we named in our HTML code. So that's all we need to know. And then this element, this line will be able to return the value of the dataset in which the button is from. So now we know which section the button was clicked from. So for example, if I clicked here, it's from the all section. If I clicked here, it's from the headphones section. So now what we want to do is we want to select the product section container. So we want to select the container of that product section. Alright, so here so this is the all sections. So here we have a class in which we call that product section, but we also have an ID. And this ID, so we'll be able to use the ID that each section has in order to select that container specifically. So this one is called product section all. When we scroll down, you can see in the headphone sections, it's called product section headphones. Since it's simply called product section and then the name of that section. Alright, so with this, we're going to create a variable called slideshow container. And what we're going to do is we want to select the specific section in which the button is from, and each section has an ID, and they're all called product section and then the name of that section. And we'll be able to include the name of that section with slideshow section, since it returns the section in which the button came from, which is from the button's parent element. And what we want to do is we want to use query selector and then call out the ID. So this time we're going to be selecting an ID, so we're going to use the ID identifier, which is a hashtag, and then each section has an ID called product section and then the name of that section. So in order to include the name of that section in the query, we're going to have to include a variable, and it's going to be the slideshow section itself. So for example, if we clicked on the all section, this should return all. So now what we want to select is the ID called product section all. So in order to do that, we're going to have to use these special apostrophes or special single quotes. So they're not normal quotes, and they should be somewhere near the escape key, so somewhere towards the left side of your keyboard. And then we're going to include a variable. In order to do that, we're going to include a $sign and then curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets is where we include the variable, and the variable we want to include is called slideshow section. So this should return, for example, if you clicked on all, a button in the all section, this should return product section all, and that is the name of the section, and that is the name of the ID in the all section. Alright, so now the last thing we're going to do is we want to select all of the product cards in that container. So now that we have the container, we want to select all of the product cards in that specific container so that we can make changes and change the product cards that are being displayed. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to select all of the product cards in the specific section in which the button was clicked from. So for example, if it was clicked in the headphone section, we want to go to the previous slide, so we want to get a different set of product cards that should be displayed. Then we want to select all of the product cards in that specific section. So in order to select, but only in that specific section, not all of the product cards in the web page. So we're going to create a new variable called product cards. So this won't be a variable, but it will be an array. So now what we want to do is we want to select all of the product cards in that specific section. We're going to be selecting only the product cards in the specific container. So we're going to use the variable in which we got from, the value in which we got from slideshow container, which would return the container in which the button was clicked from. And then we're going to use that information in order to select all of the product cards in that container. And because it is a class, we'll use the class identifier, and now we're done. Alright, so now before we process all of the product cards and we change the product cards that are being displayed, we first want to know what button was clicked, whether it be the previous button or the next button. So now we're going to create an if statement, and we want to see if the slideshow button contains the previous button class or the next button class, because when we scroll down and we check our buttons, you can see that for all sections, each button either has, all have the slideshow button, but each button either has the previous button or the next button as their class. So we want to use class list in order to identify what button it has. So now in the if statement, we want to type in the button, and we want to call out the class list property so that we can know what classes are in the buttons. And then we want to know if the button contains a class, and the class name we put it in the parameter and in single quotes, which is important. And we want to know if it has the previous button first. So first we're going to work on the previous button. So if the person has clicked on a class that had the previous button, so that means it would be this arrow here. So if they clicked the previous button, then that means the last element in the product cards per row should go away and another new element should come, but from the left side. Alright, so now when we scroll up, we can see that we created a variable which we have called last element, and we set it to the number of product cards per row by 1. So we already created this element when we wanted to change when we wanted to set how the product cards would be displayed in a section. So we control the number of product cards that are shown in the section. So now we're going to use this element right here in our loop and in our if statement, and want to change the value of the last element. So the value of the last element is always the last element in the row. And what we want to do is we want to change the last element. So when we click on the previous button, this should no longer be the last element in the row, but this should be the last element in the row. So this should move here, this should move here, this should move here, and we're going to use a for loop for that. But first of all, we want to change the last element, and in order to achieve that, we're going to have to set last element to whatever the last element was currently, and then we're going to subtract that by 1. So for example, in this case, the last element's position is 3, so it's not going to be 4 because positioning always starts from 0, 1, 2, 3. And now it's going to be number 2, and in order to achieve 2, we obviously subtract the last element by 1. But an easy way to do this is, or simpler or shorter way to do this, is to basically just add 2 hyphens or 2 subtraction signs, and this will basically achieve what we want to do, which is to decrease the last element by 1. So now the next thing that we want to do is we want to see, so we're going to create an else if statement, and we want to check and see whether the button contains the next element. So we're going to type in the button and then the class list. So we want to check what classes are in the button, and then we want to see if the button happens to contain the next element. So that means if this if condition is not true, then that means this condition is the next condition that the if statement should process. So if the button does not contain the previous button, but it contains the next button, then that means we want to increase the last element by 1. So that means, for example, if the last element is position number 3, we wanted to change to position number 4, so we need to increment the value by 1, the last element by 1. So simply either we do last element equals to whatever the current last element is, and then plus 1. But an easy way to do this is to simply add 2 plus signs, and that will achieve the trick for us. Now we're not done with the if statement, we're not done with the if condition just yet, because there are a few problems that we need to consider. For example, this is the first slide, and if we click on the previous button, there's nothing previous, but there is, if you click on the next button, there's always a product card that is going to be next. But since this is the first slide, there's nothing previous. So if you click on the previous button, then that means if this is the last element, the one following, this is the one following, but then there won't be any product card positioned over here for us. So that can be a problem, and we're going to fix that very soon. But first, let's include our for loop. But before that, let's close in the if statement. So just in case the button may not have the previous button class, and if it does not contain the next button class, then that means an error has occurred because the button should have either of the two. So we're going to just type in a console log error. So we want to type in console log if it does not happen to work, that an error occurred, so that it can be easier for us to check where the problem is. So now let's create the for loop. So inside our for loop, we basically want to control and to change what product cards are being displayed. So for example, when we click on next, whether it be next or previous, then for example, if we click on previous, we want the last element to hide, and then these 3 product cards plus another one previous to the first element to be displayed. So a new product card should be displayed. So maybe it was hidden before, now it should be displayed, and then the last element should be hidden. So just like that, for all the other elements, we want to change what product cards are hidden and what product cards are displayed. So now what we want to do is create a for loop. And first of all, we're going to set I to the first element in the product cards list, because now what we're going to do is we're going to process all of the product cards that we returned, and what we returned is the product cards that are in the container that the slideshow button was clicked from. So now what we're going to do is, so we set the value of I to 0, so the first element in the product cards list. And then the second thing we want to do is include our condition. So we want to make sure that I is always less than the product card's length. If it happens to exceed that, then the for loop should stop. So I should be less than the product card, the array's full length. And then we want to increment the value of I once the function has been, once I has been processed, and the function has finished or ended, then we want I to increment until this condition is no longer true. So now we're going to include the curly brackets and inside. So what we're going to do is want to process all of the product cards in the array. So it's not just these product cards, but all that are in the container, all of the product cards that are in the container. Hence why we set the condition to end at the total product cards array length. So first we're going to include an if statement. So in the if statement, we want to make sure, before we add the if statement, let me show you what we're going to do. So we're going to add an if statement, and since we're processing all of the product cards that are in the array or that are in the container, we want to make sure that I is always either the first element or greater than the first element. So it should be 0, or in this case, or in this example, it could be 0 or 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But we also want to make sure that I is always either the last element or less than the last element. So it could be, well, in this case, it could be 3 or 2, 1, 0, or anything less than that. So it should be either the first equal to the first element or greater than that, or the last, and not or, but and the last, either the last element or less than that. So now we're going to create that if statement, and first we're going to start with making sure that I is always either the last element or less than the last element. So I should be less than or equal to last element. And then we also want to make sure that I is either the first element or greater than the first element. So I should be, and we do not need to create a new variable for this. So I should be either equals to or greater than the first element, and the first element is always going to be whatever the last element is subtracted by the number of product cards per row. So for example, because we have not included the curly brackets yet, so this if statement is incomplete, and we have not included any value here. So let's include the value of the first element, which should be the last element subtracted by the number of product cards per row, which should be also subtracted by 1 because we want to get the last element's position. So if we reload this, the first element is always going to be whatever the last element is subtracted by the total number of product cards that are in a row. So now let's test our if statement or theory. So last element now has been incremented by 1, so it's no longer 3 but 4. So 4 minus the number of product cards that are in this row. The number of product cards that are in this row are 4 minus 1, which is 3. So 4 minus 3 will give you 1. As now, since we clicked on the next button, the first element is now element position number 1, and it's no longer position 0. So I hope you understand that. So now inside the if statement, if both conditions are true, then that means we want to make sure that that product card is displayed. So that means we want to include the active class, since the active class sets the width and height to its proper width, to its proper full value. And if the if statement conditions are not true, then that means we remove the active class, which will cause the width and height to be set to 0. So if it's true, then we want to include the active class. So in order to do that, as we have done before, we simply call out the product card itself, access its position, and then we're going to add the class using class list, and specifically the add method, and then the class that we want to add, which is the active class. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to include spacing. So first of all, for the product cards that are being displayed, we want to control the amount of spacing that should be added, and we explained this in part 5 of the eLife web series. So up above, when we check our code, we can see that we have set, we created this function specifically so that we can calculate the spacing that was appropriate for each product card to have, and we made sure that we used margin right spacing. So we added spacing to the right side of each product card except the last element, since the last element did not need any right spacing, since there was nothing next to the last element. So it was always all elements in the row except the last one. So we already calculated the amount of margin spacing needed, so please do check out part 5 of our web series So now scrolling back down, we want to create an if statement to make sure that whatever the current element we're processing, we want to add spacing to that product card. But if it is the last element, then we'll set the margin right spacing to 0. So now let's include our if statement, and here we want to make sure that if I happens to be the last element, then we'll set the spacing of that product card to 0. However, if it is false, if this condition is false and it is not the last element but before the last element, then we'll create an else statement and we'll include that margin spacing. So let's just copy this, and we're going to use the special single quotes, and so that we can include the variable that we created called margin spacing, in which we calculated the right amount of spacing. And in order to include the variable, we always need to use the single quotes because we will not work with normal quotes. And then we're going to include the syntax $sign with 2 curly brackets. So inside the curly brackets we include the variable, and then after the curly brackets, or even before the $sign, we can include any string value that we want. But specifically, we want to include the unit of the margin spacing. So first, let's include the variable. So we need to include the unit that it should have, and that is going to be in syntax form, or in string form. And we're going to choose pixels as normal. Okay, so now we need to create a function in which if condition statement happens to be false. So if one of the conditions are false, or if both of the conditions are false, then that means we're going to create an else statement, and we're going to do the opposite of what we did above. So what we want to do here is we want to remove the active class, because if none of these conditions are true, so if I is not the first element or greater than that, or if it's not the last element or less than that, then that means that product card should not be displayed, should be hidden. So we need to remove the active class, and by removing the active class, we're setting the width and the height to 0. So we're going to copy this, and this time we're going to use the remove method instead. So now we need to make sure that if the product card has been set, if the width and height of the product card has been set to 0, we also want to remove the spacing as well and set it to 0. Otherwise, there would be unnecessary spacing. So for example, if this was now hidden, there would still be spacing even though the width and height was set to 0. So there would be spacing before the next element. So for example, if I click on next, we can see that the last element is now in the next line because there's not enough space in this line in itself because of the product card's first element spacing, which we have not removed. So we need to remove it here. So we're just going to copy this line, since all we're going to do is remove that spacing. And now when we click on next, the next element was incremented by 1, which is why a new product card was displayed and the previous product card was hidden. And also when we click on the previous button, the previous next element is now hidden and the first element is now displayed. So we can see that our function works just like we wanted to. And there's also a smooth transition, which we have used with CSS in order to achieve. And that's because of the only thing that we used to achieve this smooth transition is because of the width and height value, which we have set from 260 to 0. And we use the transition property in order to slow that animation down. So please do check out part 4 and part 3 of our web series in order to know what we added in our CSS. So now we can see that our slideshow works, but we're still not done. We still have a small issue that we need to fix, which is above here. So when we scroll up to our if statements that we created here, we were able to decrement the value of the last statement if the previous button was clicked, increment the last element if the next button was clicked. However, for example, now this is the first slideshow. So for example, if we reload, this is the first slide of the slideshow, and there's no product card because this product card here has the position of 0 in the product cards array. So if we clicked on the previous button, then something would not go right. So the last element would be hidden, but nothing next to the first element will be shown. And if we keep clicking on it, nothing will be shown and everything will be hidden. However, when you click on next, all the product cards should be displayed. And if we go to the last slide, so this is the last slide of the slideshow. So that means the position of this element right here is position number 12. And now we want it to go back to the first slideshow if we click on next. So if we click on next, we want it to move back to the first slide of the slideshow. But how can it do so if the value of the last element is 12? How can we change? We cannot really. And if we click on the next element, we set it to increment the last element always. So if we click on next, it should increment it to 13, but there's no 13. We need to set it back to position 0. So if you click on next right now, you can see that no other product card is shown because there's no element in the array with a position of 13 because the last element is position number 12. So now we need to create a solution that fixes this issue for us. So first of all, let's reload our page. So first of all, let's work on the previous button. So for the previous button, if the next button is clicked, then everything should work just fine. But if it's in the first slide and the previous button was clicked, then that means we want the slideshow to access the last slide of the array of the slideshow. So the current position of the first element is 0, and you cannot, if we click on the previous button, it should decrement to -1, but there's no -1 positioning. So now we want to set the product card position to the last slideshow, which is position number 12 as stated before. So now we will have to include an if statement. First of all, we want to know if the last element happens to be the number of product cards that there are in a row subtracted by 1. So if the last element for example, in this screen, or in this example, if the last element was number 3, then the previous button should not be clicked. So now let's create an if statement. So if the last element is less than or equal to the number of, well, we'll use a bracket, is equal to the number of product cards that are in a row, but subtracted by 1 since positioning starts from 0, then that means something else should happen. Then that means the last element should be set. So for example, this is the first slide of the slideshow, and if the previous button is clicked, the first element cannot be -1, or the next elements that we access cannot be -1 since that does not exist, but it should move to the last slide of the slideshow. So it should move to this slide over here. So we want the last element to be of product cards in the array. So not in the row, but in the array this time. So the last element in this case should be set to 11. And in order to access that, the number of product cards that there are in an array should be in the value product cards, which is this right here, which returns the total number of product cards, all of the product cards in a container. But we want to get the length of that array. So in our case, it should return 12 product cards because there are 12 product cards in a container. So this should return the number 12. But we want to get the last element's position, and the last element's position, because positioning starts from 0, then that means we have to subtract by 1. So the last element will be set to position number 11, which should get the last element in the product cards array. Otherwise, if this is not true, and if the last element is any value greater than in our case 3, so for example, if it was position number 4 or anything greater than that, then that means the last element can be decremented by 1. So now let's test our theory and what we've just done. So now when we reload our page and when we click on the previous button, we can see that we access the last slide of the slideshow, which is what we wanted. But now we are in the last slide. We're in the last slide of the slideshow. If we are in the last slide of the slideshow and we want to click on next, then that means we want to access the first slide of the slideshow. But now next does not work, and the next product card does not appear, and we wanted to access the first slide or to display the product cards that are in the first slide of the slideshow. So in order to access the first slide of the slideshow, we're going to create another if statement. So the last element of the slideshow. So now if the last element happens to be the same value of the number of product cards that are in a row, but since we want to get the last element's position, we have to subtract it by 1 because positioning starts from 0 rather than 1. So we're going to first access the product cards array. We want to get the length of the array and then subtract it by 1. And then, so if this condition happens to be true and the current last element happens to be the last element of the array, then that means we want the last element to be set so that the slideshow accesses the first slide of the slideshow. So we want the last element to turn into a number or into an element that will cause the slideshow to move to the first slide of the slideshow, which is right here. And in order to access the last element of the first slideshow, it's going to be the total number of product cards that there are in a row and then subtracted by 1. So in our case, the last element of the first slide of the slideshow would be 0, 1, 2, 3. So that means the last element of the first slide of the slideshow would be the number 3. And in order to access position number 3, we'd have to first set the last element to be the total number of product cards that there are in a row, which is 4, and then we're going to subtract that by 1. So if this condition is not true, is false, and the last element is not the total number of product cards that there are in an array that's subtracted by 1, then that means the last element can be incremented. So now when we reload our page, we can see that when we click on the previous button and the first slide, it takes us to the last slide of the slideshow, which is what we want. And then now, since we just fixed the next slideshow, let's see if the last slide takes us to the first slide of the slideshow. And it effectively does. And when we click on next, it should work just as normal, so the last element is incremented by 1 every time. But if it's in the last slide, it takes us back to the first slide of the slideshow, and when we click on the previous button, it takes us to the last slide of the slideshow, and when we click on the previous button, the last element is decremented by 1 instead. So now we can see that our function works, and when we test it out in other sections or other containers, we can see that the same works as well. When you clicking on next, when we're in the last slide and we want to go to the first slide, and when we click on next, it should take us to the first slide, and when we click on the previous button and its first slide, it should take us to the last slide, which it does effectively. So now the function of the slideshow is created and done. Alright, and now we are at the end of part 7. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button, comment down below, and subscribe to Code Harvest. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in part 8 of the eLife web series. Goodbye!